As I mentioned, I wanted to try to get outside at least one day this week. It's a little warmer out than I actually thought it would be, but I'm sitting out here on the our back porch with some of our flowers. Those are our black-eyed Susans, or cone flowers, would I guess be the more technical name for them. They're doing pretty well. I've had to clip them a little bit to get them to grow at least for one more pass before the end of the season. But as I promised, this is the video, or the second video, I should say, about the Mike Rose essay. So what I'm going to do is, over the next few minutes, talk a little bit about some of the ideas that you want to pay attention to, not only for the quiz that we're going to have next week, but also for the first paper that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And I'll spend a lot more time on the structure of the paper and how to approach it later next week. But I want you to start thinking about it a little bit. So I've written down a couple of things that you're also going to see up on Blackboard, but I'm using my handy dandy whiteboard to do this. So these are really the three major things that I want you to focus on and think about as you're preparing for the quiz. And I'll read off these in a second, but just to kind of give you a sense of what I'd like you to think about. So first of all, make sure as you're going through the essay that you have a good sense of what cognitive variability is. If you watched the other video from two days ago, you'll remember that I said that's a major phrase that Mike Rose uses in those last two paragraphs. And that is really the whole point of his essay. These different ways that people contribute to their workplaces, the different kinds of work that they do, and the different ways in which they draw on very, very different kinds of skills in order to be successful in their workplaces. And cognitive variability is just a fancy way of saying that we all think differently, that we're all very unique in our talents and in our abilities, and also in our affinities. And when I say affinities, what I mean by that is those things that we enjoy doing, or that we have a natural or innate talent for. And we all have something that we're strong at, that we're good at. And so he's trying to identify that in the essay. What are these different kinds of thinking skills, and how do all those different types of thinking skills contribute to the democratic society that he says he would like to live in? So second one on here, another term that I want you to be familiar with, is Cartesian. Now that's one that I didn't talk about a lot yesterday, but Cartesian here is referring to Rene Descartes. And if you looked at those other notes that I posted, what you'll remember is that his famous saying is, "I think, therefore I am." And that was his way of distinguishing human beings from other animals, from other living creatures, from flowers, from plants, from all these other things that surround us, that we have this ability to think and to reason, which is not necessarily something that other creatures have. I might disagree with that, because my cat, Rosie, is actually pretty smart and pretty on the ball with stuff. But whether she has higher level reasoning abilities, that we don't know for sure. If she does, she doesn't really talk about it. So one of the things he argues for is the idea that because in a lot of Western cultures, in our society in particular, we so much emphasize intellectual skills that we often ignore the kinds of intellectual reasoning that is required for physical labor, for manual labor, and that those things should not be dismissed. So that idea of Cartesian, those things relating back to Rene Descartes, are those things that privilege our reasoning abilities, and sort of ignore those other parts that make us human. So for example, when I'm gardening, when I'm taking care of these flowers behind me, I'm not necessarily going through some intellectual process in my brain. It is more of a physical process. I know which stems I have to cut. I know, when to cut them, when to leave them alone, when to water them, when to feed them. And those are both a kind of physical labor, and it's also an intellectual labor. So he's trying to find the connections between those two different kinds of labor, and he's trying to celebrate both of them, okay? And he uses his mother as an example from that. So if you look at this last question that I have up here, I say, what did Rosie, his mom, learn at that diner? And you'll notice what he does, and this is a really fascinating part of the essay, is he breaks down the different skills she needed. She needed time management. She needed the skills of a psychologist, because she had to sometimes deal with difficult customers, sometimes lonely customers, sometimes customers who didn't know what they wanted at all and might have been trying to rush her. So you'll notice there's a line in there where he says that she had an interest in psychology, and she had to because of working with the public in a job like that. In fact, if you look at the photograph that I posted in the notes from a couple of days ago, what you're also going to see is the fact that she was very good at multitasking. And just ignore that for a second. We live pretty close to one of the train tracks here in Chicago, so if another one passes by like that, that's what the noise is. But let me go back to that. So what I was saying is that at work, she needed to, there's another train. Sometimes they come in twos like that. It's the red line or the purple line. There we go. Okay, that's passed by. I knew that was going to be a danger of being out here on the porch and trying to talk about some of this stuff. But you'll notice that that's what he tries to emphasize. What are the different skills that she needed at that job? She needed intellectual skills. She needed physical, manual labor skills to be able to carry all those dishes and carry all those glasses and manage her time, so that she learned how to develop both of those skill sets, the physical and the mental, so she was able to balance them. Now, why is this significant? Well, for the paper that we're going to be doing, the first paper that's due in a couple of weeks, you are going to be writing about a job experience of your own. As I mentioned, you could also interview somebody else if you wanted to. You could do a volunteer experience. It's really your choice. And if you're not sure what to pick, let me know. That's the reason I asked you that last question on the intro for this week, is that I wanted you to start thinking about a job or a volunteer position that you could write in more detail about. If you don't like what you wrote about on your intro questions for this week, that's perfectly fine. All you need to do is pick something different, and you've got plenty of time to develop this. And next week I'll post some other videos on how to develop the paper, how to structure it. But what I want you to start thinking about now would be, what sorts of skills would you be describing in your paper? So in other words, think about the way that he writes about his mother's skills and what she needed when she was doing that job at the diner. What did she need to be successful? And he runs us through all these different skills that she had and that she needed. For your paper, you're basically going to select 3 skills. That'll give you a way to structure the body of the paper. What are the 3 skills that you didn't have before that you needed to develop? Maybe you had them before, but you'd never really used them. And how did that help you perform the job effectively, even if it was a job, I should mention, that you didn't particularly like or that was particularly difficult, but you probably had to develop some kind of skills, whether it was patience, whether it was compassion, whether it was sort of mathematical skills. Maybe you were working in an office and you had to sharpen your computational skills. So that's what I want you to think about. The writing prompt that's up on Blackboard will walk you through some of these ideas, but as I mentioned in the last video, we're not responding to Mike Rose. You will have the opportunity to quote from his essay to support some of your own ideas. I'll talk more about that next week. So that'll get you into some practice using MLA format. If you haven't, if you've used it before, it'll give you the opportunity to develop those skills or to remind yourself of what they are. But we'll get into that next week. This is really a narrative paper. We get into the heavier quotations and citations with papers 2 and 3. This one is a more story narrative oriented paper, much like Mike Rose. And that's why you'll notice on the prompt, I mentioned that we're going to use him as the model. 2/3 of his essay are narratives about his mother and his uncle and about himself. And then the end of it, he gets into some explanation as to why he gave us those stories. So I want you to start thinking about how he structures his essay, because your structure is going to mimic what he does, no matter what topic it is that you're writing about, okay? So let me sum up here a little bit for this little video on the essay. For the quiz next week, these are really the 3 main things that I want you to be thinking about. Again, what is cognitive variability? What does Cartesian mean, and why does he refer to Descartes in the essay? And then lastly, what are those skills that he describes that his mother had to develop in order to be successful at her job? Okay, so those are the 3 things that I want you to think about. As always, if you have other questions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to answer them. I'll have other notes up next week on this essay. Next week also, we're going to do a short reading from Toni Morrison. You can get ahead if you want to take a look at that. It's very similar to the Mike Rose essay. Biggest difference is she's talking about her first job experience, so it's a little bit more personal. It's more of a cognitive autobiography. Remember, the essay, as he uses that phrase about his mother, is a cognitive biography. What are those skills that she had to develop for her workplace? So the Toni Morrison piece that you're going to read next week is very brief, and it's more about her first job experience. And I'm having you read that one to give you some other ideas for your paper. Toni Morrison's not going to be on the quiz. It's only Mike Rose. There's more than enough material to review in the Mike Rose essay. Okay, so just a quick summary again of Mike Rose. I'll talk more about the quiz next week, and I'll post that at the beginning, Monday or Tuesday of next week, so don't worry about that now. In the meantime, if you haven't read the Mike Rose, please make sure that you do so. If you have and you want to get ahead, read the Toni Morrison essay this weekend. Start thinking about your first paper, and if you can get outside, do that. It's looking pretty nice out here. As I mentioned, my coneflowers are doing pretty good. My gooseberry bush is doing great. It's kind of the end of the season, so all that's left of the gooseberry are these kind of last berries. They were better in June, actually, so we're just kind of getting to the very last batch of these now at the end of the season, but they are pretty tasty. Okay, so I hope you have a great weekend. If you have any other questions, please email me, and I will see you again on Monday.